and bring out its dharmic significance. Now, what could it be? What could it be? Well, it's a bit cheesy and sentimental, especially when it's filmed. Okay, it glorifies Christmas, which in our time has become a tacky consumerist extravaganza. Okay, I've told it before on Sangha night several times. But the centre team insisted that I do it again. It's true. It's true. It's true. And hey, it's a great story, actually. It's a great story. It's a very dharmic story. It clearly illustrates two important dharmic lists, and it gives a frightening illustration of the law of karma. So I'm going to tell you what one of the dharmic lists is and leave you to guess the other. So one of the dharmic lists it illustrates is what is called the 5 aspects of the spiritual life. And this isn't something that the Buddha specifically taught, but it's a description of the way we grow and develop as beings that we owe to Sangharakshita, the man who founded the Triratna community. And it isn't some sort of intellectual theory. It's a description. It's a description of how we grow. It's like saying a plant grows by putting down roots and putting up branches and leaves and flowers and then fruits and seeds. It's a description. It's a description. It's a description of something quite universal, the great universal quest of human beings, the movement towards a bigger self with greater wisdom, more in touch with reality, more in touch with our own deep riches, more able to live a fulfilled life. And because it's a universal quest, a universal journey, it describes a universal journey. The different elements of what we call the system of spiritual development, or the aspects of spiritual development, crop up in the myths and stories of cultures all over the world. And they also crop up in our story. People all over the world have a deep sense that developing ourselves according to this system is what makes a true, meaningful human life. So these elements crop up all over the place, although they may not be consciously described. So, okay, what are these 5 aspects of the spiritual life? Oops, they're not that. They are that. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and spiritual receptivity. Okay, so firstly, integration. So I'll explain it a bit, and then I'll relate it to I'll tell our story and relate it to it. So, integration. We need to become a whole, harmonious human being, not a bundle of conflicting drives if we're going to get anywhere with spiritual life or really with anything else. So we need to become an individual. We need to become a self-determining individual, not a bunch of conflicting strands and drives. So this integration, it involves owning up to parts of ourselves that we don't want to know about. The bits of ourselves we don't want to know about. It involves becoming conscious of them, allowing them to come into our awareness so that we can get them on our side. When we pretend that parts of ourselves aren't really there, because we don't like them or because they're socially unacceptable, they don't go away. They control us from the shadows of our unconscious. So we've often in classes talked about human beings as being like a horse and a rider, where the rider's the conscious mind and the horse is the deeper unconscious drives. And the rider thinks they're in control, but actually they're going where the horse wants to take them. Integration means admitting the horse is there, getting to know it, and getting it on our side. So to get anywhere with the spiritual life, or anything else very much, we need integration, or we just get taken for a ride. It's a joke. Thank you. So we need to become an individual. We need to become an individual. We also need to develop the second aspect, positive emotion. Emotion is what actually moves us. It's no good knowing all about non-self and non-duality with our head. If we want to grow beyond a sort of cramped ego, that's not going to have much effect, just knowing about it with our head. It won't affect our whole being. It won't affect our lives. It just affects the top 3 inches of our skull, not our whole being. So it's no good just knowing how interconnected we are with other beings. We need to feel the emotions that actually connect us to other beings. If we want to grow beyond that cramped ego, we actually need to experience metta, gratitude, compassion, joy, and so on. So negative emotions keep us trapped in a tight, painful focus on ourselves. They keep us cut off. Positive emotions are emotions that connect us with others and the world around us. So we need to develop and strengthen metta, compassion, our joy, our loyalty, our sense of reverence and devotion even. These all connect us to other beings and the world and to what's higher. And if we become an individual, or we try to become an individual who is not connected to others, so integration but without positive emotion, become an individual who's not connected to others, not connected to values higher than our own wants and needs, we don't actually become an individual, we become an individualist. Someone who is cut off, someone who can't join together with others to achieve anything. Someone who is just out for themselves. And being an individualist is not a pleasant or happy place to be. And it is a spiritual dead end. So we need to not just become an individual by integration, we need to become a connected individual through positive emotion. So integration and positive emotion. We need to become an individual and we need to become a connected individual. And then we come to spiritual death, which actually sounds not very attractive and a bit scary. But actually it isn't as scary as all that, because spiritual death goes along with the next aspect, spiritual rebirth. What does it mean? Well, at one level, spiritual death and rebirth can just mean that we change. It can just mean that we change. So one old, outdated version of ourselves dies, and another freer, larger version of ourselves is reborn. So at one level, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth just means that changing, that growing, leaving behind an outdated version, growing into a bigger person. But at a deeper level, or we might say on a more advanced level, spiritually, spiritual death and rebirth mean more than that. They mean more than just changing. Having become an individual and having become a connected individual, we become more than an individual through spiritual death and rebirth. The whole idea of being an individual dies. We see that our old sense of being a separate, limited individual is actually an illusion. And we become an aspect of something larger and more universal. Speaking poetically, we could say that our consciousness is transformed from being the awareness of one limited individual and becomes more like the consciousness of the world, the consciousness of reality itself. And that's spiritual rebirth at the highest level. Maybe we don't see that in our story, but we do definitely see spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, that lower level of leaving behind an old self, being reborn as somebody much bigger and freer and more expansive. So that's the first four. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, and spiritual rebirth. Becoming an individual, becoming a connected individual, and then becoming something more than what we normally think of as an individual. When Sangharakshita first talked about this system of spiritual development, he just talked about those four aspects. But later a fifth was added. spiritual receptivity. Because spiritual change, spiritual rebirth is not something that we can make happen. So when we become a new self, our old self cannot imagine what that new self will be like. Our old self can't bring a new self into existence. So it's always going to be coming from outside, as it were. We need to be open and receptive to a new self that comes from outside ourselves, as we are now. We need to be receptive to finding out new things about ourselves. We need to be open to messages from heights and depths we didn't even know we had. So at every stage, we need that sort of receptivity. We need to be open to a wisdom that's greater than the wisdom we have now. Whether that comes from other people who are further along the path than we are, or whether it comes from our own heights and depths. We need to be open to it. We need to be receptive, because without that, we're stuck as we are now. We're stuck as we are now. Positive change can't happen. So that's a little bit about the 5 aspects of the spiritual life, which I've sort of reframed as become an individual, become a connected individual, and become more than what we usually think of as an individual. And throughout that, listen to the voice of a wisdom that comes from somewhere beyond the person we are now. Oh yeah, I was going to tell a story. And bring out how that illustrates these 5 aspects. And it also illustrates another list. And if you've been around for a while, try to guess what the other list is. There will be a quiz later. Okay, what's the story? It's Scrooge. Of course it is. It's the Christmas Carol. So the Christmas Carol, the story of Scrooge, starts with introducing us to one Ebenezer Scrooge. Ebenezer Scrooge, a character whose very name has passed into our culture as a synonym with miserable miserliness. So Scrooge is what we might call today a successful businessman. He's a successful man in the terms of which our society measures success. He does well at his business. He has plenty of money. And in fact, of course, he's famous for being obsessed with money and very reluctant to give any of it away. So Dickens describes Scrooge as squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel ever struck out generous fire. Secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, made his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature about him. He iced his office in the summer and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. Poor guy. So Dickens' metaphor for Scrooge, one of his metaphors for Scrooge is cold. Scrooge is the very antithesis of the warm emotions. He's cold. He's, where we go? He's cold within him froze his features. So he's cold. He's the antithesis of the warm, positive emotions. He's the antithesis of the emotions the Dharma tells us to cultivate, which connect us to others and open up the way for us to experience reality. So he's completely cut off from others because he's closed to those emotions. He is the opposite of connected. He's the opposite of a connected individual. And because he is shut off from the positive emotions, he's trapped in himself. So Dickens described him as self-contained, secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. Cut off, completely cut off. The Dharma tells us we exist in relationship with others, intimate interrelationship with others in the world around us. We need to be connected rather than cut off. But Scrooge suffers from this delusion that he somehow exists in this self-contained manner. He's enough in himself. He's going to be happy if he just looks after himself. He thinks it's a virtue to be concerned only with himself. So he tells some people who come around collecting for the poor, it's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Completely cut off, just about himself. So he's trapped, cut off from others, the opposite of connected. Dickens tells us nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with glad looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come and see us?" But what did Scrooge care? He edged his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. So Scrooge is also materialistic and rational and cynical. He only values what can be seen and measured. So when his nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas, he famously replies, "Ah, humbug." And what he says is, "What reason have you to be merry? Merry Christmas, what reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." To which his nephew, who is more than a match for him, says, "Well, what reason have you got to be dismal for then? You're rich enough." Touché. So Scrooge thinks that being poor equals being unhappy, being rich equals being happy. To me, Scrooge seems to be very much in keeping with the spirit of our times. The message we're bombarded with in the media is that the way to be happy is to be rich and have loads of stuff. So we have to sacrifice everything for economic growth. Economic growth, having more money and stuff, that's what governments are about, that's what everything about. It's the key to human well-being. We don't seem to have noticed that we are already rich enough, like Scrooge, and yet so many people live unfulfilled happy lives that are unhappy lives that are dismal, also like Scrooge. As a society, we are rich enough. What reason have we got to be so dismal then? But like Scrooge, we have more depression and anxiety and mental illness than ever before. Anyway, so what reason have you to be dismal then? You're rich enough. So although it's Christmas Eve, and it should be the season of goodwill to all, Scrooge is thoroughly nasty to his nephew and refuses his invitation to Christmas dinner. And he's thoroughly nasty to his poor put-upon clerk, Bob Cratchit. He's thoroughly nasty to the charity collectors collecting money for the poor. So he says to them, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And if some do die, well, that will just reduce the surplus population." So he's all reason and no human empathy, no positive emotion. He lives on the surface of things, cut off from the depths, cut off from any sort of emotion. So that's Scrooge. Cold, cut off, cynical. But then, as a very cold, frosty, foggy night falls just before Christmas, he makes his way home from his office through the gathering gloom. It's just about dark when he gets home. And in the gloom, something from the depths or the heights erupts into his narrow, conscious mind. Something erupts, but he doesn't want it. Some wisdom erupts, but he doesn't want it. It's very unwelcome because it might disturb the narrow, limited way of life that his conscious mind finds safe and comfortable. So it comes as in a very unpleasant way because he's resistant to it. He's the opposite of receptive. So in the gloom, he reaches for his doorknob. But instead of his usual doorknob, he sees the head of his old business partner, Jacob Marley, who has been dead these past 6 years. And he recoils in shock and horror. And then he reminds himself that he's a down-to-earth rationalist, and he says, "Bah, humbug." So he collects himself together and he opens the door and he double locks the door because, good materialist that he is, he thinks that double locking the door will keep out whatever it is that's threatening him. But then when he gets into the hallway of his big, dark, empty, gloomy house, he thinks he sees a hearse with a coffin going up the wide stairs. And then when he gets into his big, dark, gloomy living room and sees his huge innate fireplace, which is carved with all sorts of figures, he thinks that each figure has the head of his dead partner, Jacob Marley. Then a bell starts to toll, and he hears the clanking of chains. It's a great ghost story. As though someone is dragging them across the floor, and Marley's ghost appears before him looking miserable and all wrapped about in chains, which is dragging behind him. So all this stuff about death and the appearance of a ghost, we could say, is the eruption of some sort of wisdom about reality from the depths or the heights of Scrooge's conscious awareness into his conscious awareness. So impermanence is a fact. Death is a fact. We will die. This is the reality. And in the light of all that reality, all of Scrooge's material success and all his money starts to look completely meaningless. None of that gives him any protection. So from somewhere, this truth about impermanence and death thrusts itself on Scrooge, something that he should have reflected upon, something that that would have turned his mind if he had reflected on it and caused him to live a different life. But Scrooge isn't going to be receptive. Scrooge is not going to be receptive. He still tries to protect himself with his old defense of cynical skepticism. So he tries to make a joke of it. He says, a vision like this is more the result of a bad dinner. He says, this ghost smells more of gravy than the grave. So he makes a joke of it. But whatever it is that's appearing to Scrooge as Jacob Marley, it's not going to be put off. It's not going to be put off. So the ghost tells Scrooge that the reason he's wrapped in chains is because of his self-centered life, in which he didn't care about anyone but himself. So he's doomed to wander in chains. He says, the chains are of my own making. I made them link by link, by the mean and selfish way I live my life, and now I have to drag them around. He says, I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wear it. So there's another bit of wisdom erupting from somewhere into Scrooge's conscious awareness, the truth of the law of karma. If we act unskillfully in a way that cuts us off from other people and reality, we create fetters and chains for ourselves that we have to carry around. We make them link by the way we live our life, by each and every action, one of our actions. If we act unskillfully, we create chains. If we act skillfully in a way that connects us, we gradually weaken and dissolve the chains and manacles that bind us. We become more and more free. So Jacob Marley's ghost tells Scrooge about the reality of the law of karma and says that he has come to warn him. Would you like to know, he says, the weight and length of the coil you bear yourself? It was just as heavy and long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago, but you've been working on it ever since. It is a ponderous chain. So he tells Scrooge that he's spent a long time making just the same sorts of chains for himself, and that unless he changes his life, he will face the same sort of horrible fate, doomed to wander around as an unhappy spirit, dragging the chains he created by his actions, by his karma, forever doomed to regret for having wasted the opportunity to do something positive while he was alive. So he's wasting his opportunity. Yeah, so Jacob Marley's ghost, or whatever it represents, forces Scrooge's conscious mind to face the reality of impermanence and death that he'd rather forget. It shows him the reality of the law and karma, and it points out that he has a precious opportunity that he will regret forever if he wastes it. So, out of concern for his old partner, he gives him this terrible warning. And he tells him he must change. He tells him he must change. And he says, you're going to see 3 more spirits tonight that will bring the change about that needs to happen. But completely in character, for someone who is all reason and totally out of touch with emotion, Scrooge says, well, you've already warned me. You've already warned me. Can't we do without the 3 spirits? I already know I've got to change. Can't I just do without the 3 spirits? In other words, I now know with my head that what you're telling me is true. But of course, that's not enough. That's not enough to know with his head. He's got to have the 3 spirits. He's got to go deeper. It's got to affect his emotions. It's got to be a genuine whole person experience. So Marley's ghost tells him it doesn't work like that. There won't be any change unless he experiences the emotions that these 3 spirits are going to bring about. He needs to be moved in his whole being. It's not enough to just know. So sure enough, in the course of the night, 3 different ghosts appear to Scrooge as he tries to sleep in his big, gloomy, dark, lonely house. Or we could say there are 3 sort of eruptions of wisdom from his heights or his depths in different phases. So the first one that appears, the first ghost that appears at 1 o'clock in the morning, is the ghost of Christmas past. And the ghost wants to show Scrooge some things from the past. But Scrooge really, really doesn't want to know. Scrooge does not want to know. He is anything but receptive. I mean, apparently the ghost is described as shining out light, and Scrooge tries to damp it down. Light is awareness. Scrooge is trying to dampen this awareness. He does not want this awareness of the past. But in the end, the ghost, as it were, grabs Scrooge by the scruff of the neck and takes him on a journey against his will. He carries him out into the night over London, over the surrounding countryside, until he gets to a landscape that Scrooge remembers from his childhood. And there he is shown himself sitting as a miserable young boy, miserable, poor, lonely, and neglected, sitting reading all by himself. Scrooge obviously had this terrible, sad, friendless, lonely, neglected childhood. At some level, he is still that child. He is a sad and lonely person. But the last thing he wants is to be aware of that. The last thing he wants is to become aware of that, aware of his sadness and loneliness. Sadness and loneliness are not emotions he's going to allow himself to feel or own up to. They would destroy his image of himself. And he thinks he's better than everybody else. So until now, he's thrust them down. He's refused to own up to them. He's refused to be aware of them. The ghost has to drag him unwillingly to see his own sadness and his own loneliness. When we refuse to be aware of our emotions like that, they don't go away. They rule us from the shadows of our consciousness. So we can see Scrooge's whole way of life as a way of sort of compensating for this sadness and loneliness. He doesn't feel accepted by people. So he tries to look down on ordinary people by having more money than they do. He tries to separate himself, make himself different and better. The things that he won't own up to about himself are ruling him from the shadows. They're directing his horse, if you like. When we refuse to be aware of painful emotions like sadness, also that tends to freeze our whole emotional life. We don't really feel any emotion if we shut ourselves off from the painful emotions. So the cold within him froze his old features, we're told. He's frozen himself. He's frozen his emotions by refusing to feel. refusing to feel the sadness and the loneliness of that child. So that now he carries his own low temperature about with him always. He ices his office in the summer and he doesn't warm it 1 degree at Christmas. So to keep his sadness away, he froze all emotion and he now has no positive emotion. But as we've seen, the ghost dragged him unwillingly to an awareness of his childhood, an awareness of his sadness and loneliness and sense of alienation from others. And having become aware of it, he could integrate it. He could make it part of himself. He could integrate it. He could make friends with that lonely child that he had been. He could become more of an integrated individual. And this happens, and it seems to release a flood of positive emotion. So he feels compassion for the suffering of his younger self. And this immediately turns into compassion for other children like the child that he was. He gets an uprush of regret for having turned away a child like himself who came to his door begging for food. And he's also shown his sister who died as a young adult, and he re-experiences the sadness and devastation at her death. So he experiences that, and this releases a flood of fond feelings for her, the love that he had frozen out. And then he's shown himself in his first job. He's shown his close friend at the time, Dick, and his very kind employer with the very Dickensian name of Mr. Fezziwig. And he remembers the kindness that his employer showed to him, and he feels this strong uprush of gratitude. So Scrooge lets this awareness of the suffering he experienced as a child, which he'd been pushing down into unawareness, he lets this come into the light of consciousness. And when he does this, he finds it opens the door to a whole flood of other positive emotions. Compassion for the suffering of others, compassion for his own suffering. Metta, gratitude. So integration and positive emotion closely linked. And then the ghost vanishes. But acknowledging the suffering he experienced as a child and the arising of some human sympathy for others, the memory of warm feelings that he's suppressed to protect himself, his gratitude for benefits he received from others, all these have started to change in Scrooge. Something's started to happen. So when the next ghost appears, the ghost of Christmas present, he is open to what it has to show him, whereas before he just didn't want to know. He was fighting tooth and nail. Now he wants to know. He's receptive. So he says, if you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it. That's a big change in Scrooge. And the second ghost, the ghost of Christmas present, basically what it does is show Scrooge other people enjoying Christmas. Or rather, it shows him other people enjoying their warm, close relationships with others. And it shows him especially people he thinks he is better than because he is richer than they, and they are poor. So he shows him his poor nephew, who he'd said bar humbug to very famously, with his friends and his fiancée. And he shows him his poor, unprepossessing clerk, Bob Cratchit, who turns out to be not so poor after all because he has a much richer life than Scrooge because he's loved by others and he loves others. But so he sees all these people who he's previously thought he was superior to, actually having a good time when he's not. But hardest to take of all, he is shown himself as he looks in their eyes. So what he sees is that other people, far from thinking that he's better than them because of his wealth, they actually feel sorry for him. They feel sorry for him for the way he's cut off from human relationships and from positive emotions like love and joy. And that's a big dose of self-knowledge for Scrooge. Suddenly, the sort of defended castle of his self in which he set himself up as superior doesn't look so attractive or superior after all. Instead of everybody thinking he's better than they are because he's so rich, which is what he's trying to achieve, they feel sorry for him. So he becomes sick of himself. He becomes sick of himself as he has created himself. He becomes ready for a spiritual death, ready to leave that person he's built behind. And then finally, in the last watches of the night, the third spirit appears to him, the ghost of Christmas yet to be. And in this, he sees his own death. And he sees the legacy he leaves behind him. He sees that the important businessmen who he thinks of as his peers, the people whose respect he wants, he sees what they really think of him. So one of them says, it'll be a very cheap funeral because no one will go. And another one says, well, maybe I'll go for the free lunch. He sees that he has absolutely no friends in the world whatsoever. He sees that people steal his possessions that he's treasured so much, they just get scattered, and there's nothing he can do about it. He sees himself dying alone, lonely, miserable. And he thinks, avarice, hard-dealing, griping cares, they have brought me to a rich end truly. And he asks the spirit if there's anyone who feels any regret at his death. And he's shown a couple who owe him money and are near to being thrown. He's nearly thrown them out of his house because they owe him, thrown them out of their house because they owe him money on the mortgage. And he sees how glad they are that he's dead because they think that whoever takes on the debt can't be as hard-hearted as Scrooge. So the only people who've got any emotional response to his death are glad. And then he's shown the future after his death. Someone else is in his chair in his office. Everything carries on as it was. He might as well never have existed. The only sign of his life is an overgrown gravestone that nobody can be bothered to look after. And then the morning starts, so the sun starts to appear, or a little bit of glimmer starts to appear. And the ghost of Christmas yet to be morphs into his bedpost. He really thought he was dead. He's experienced a spiritual death, and he really thought he was dead. So he's just immensely relieved. It seems to him that he has had a reprieve. He had been given an amazing opportunity. He'd been given that precious opportunity back. He still has a chance to do something to change himself and the impact he has on the world. He's been offered a spiritual rebirth. He's been reborn. He says, I am light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there. Whoop. Hello. I don't know what month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Whoop. So he's like a new baby. He has been reborn. He has died and been reborn. He has suffered a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth, a profound emotional experience of all of the stages of the path, of integration with his childhood, of an uprush of positive emotion, of spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and a growing receptivity to what he's being shown. So he sends a turkey to his clerk, Bob Cratchit's house by taxi. He gives him a large sum of money to the charity collectors he'd mocked earlier. He goes to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner and has a great time. He's completely reborn as a happy man. Dickens says of him, he became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not laugh. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. So, So I hope you've enjoyed our seasonal story. I think you'll agree it's a very clear example of someone becoming more integrated, experiencing positive emotion, as a result experiencing a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth. The whole process being accompanied by an opening up of spiritual receptivity. And it also illustrates another list. Jacob Marley's ghost tries to remind Scrooge of 4 things he should have known, he should have reflected upon, which would have completely changed his life for the better. What are they? Yes! Who said that? Who said that? Yes, it's the 4 reminders. The 4 reminders. So these are things that all Buddhists are encouraged to reflect upon. Oops, not that one. So the ghost really reminds him of impermanence and death big time. And that has wasted his precious opportunity. So we think of human life, we think of the precious opportunity of human life. What this amazing opportunity we've got to do something positive with our lives. I mean, it's not just enough to be a human. We've actually got leisure. We live in a sort of society where we've got freedom and leisure to do something. We've got the capabilities. That's not true of most people who've existed. It's a precious opportunity. We're advised to reflect on that. Let's do something with it. And it's a limited term offer, because we're going to die. And we're all going to die. And that should put other things in a different perspective. Karma is a reality. You really do carry the chains around. We really can make chains for ourselves by the law of karma, as Scrooge was shown. The last one's a little bit more difficult. No happiness in samsara. I think we could reframe that as saying you can't get happiness from external things. So there's no way you can get happy by having loads of stuff. There's no way you can get happy by loads of entertainment, loads of food, whatever. No happiness in samsara. So in a way, that one sums up the moral of the whole story. But yeah, that's definitely the message of Jacob Marley's ghost. Jacob Marley's ghost could almost have known about the 4 reflections, because he certainly gave them. And we are encouraged to reflect on them. And they're quite big reflections, actually. So, I mean, it's quite a good idea to reflect on maybe one or another or all of those, perhaps with our morning meditation. Because to really know them would make the sort of life that Scrooge lived, which we don't live, but maybe there's a little bit like that. It would make that life impossible. Anyway, thank you. That was a seasonal story. Yeah.